Well, good morning, Greenwich, and welcome to the Wednesday, December 8th edition of the Basement Academy. Interesting note on our morning psalm, Psalm 98. This is the psalm that sits behind Joy to the World, our Christmas hymn, Joy to the World, which was not originally written, as I understand it, to be a Christmas carol or Christmas hymn. Isaac Watts just taking the psalm and restating it in light of Jesus Christ. It got picked up into, appropriately so, and thankfully so, into the Christmas cycle. So next time you hear Joy to the World, think Psalm 98. Okay, here it is. Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. His right hand and his holy arm have worked salvation for him. The Lord has made his salvation known and revealed his righteousness to the nations. He has remembered his love and his faithfulness to the house of Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Burst into jubilant song with music. Make music to the Lord with the harp and the sound of singing, with trumpets and the blast of the ram's horn. Shout for joy before the Lord, the King. Let the sea resound and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. Let the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains sing together for joy. Let them sing before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples with equity. Psalm 98, joy to the world. The Lord has come. Amen. All right. Said yesterday, I want to think a little bit more about what Jemar Tisby in his book, The Color of Compromise, spoke about that yesterday. The Color of Compromise, he makes some suggestions at the end. Again, I'd put it on your Christmas list. Go ahead and read it, listen to it, interact with it, wrestle with it, or let it wrestle with you. I'm not saying you'll agree at every point with what Tisby has to say, but pay attention to the pinch points where you find yourself resisting, pushing back, saying, yeah, but what about? Pay attention there. Are we just resisting because it makes us uncomfortable? Or are we resisting because it's not squaring with truth? And so, we need to be thoughtful about that. At the end of the book, he makes a number of suggestions. His last chapter is kind of what to do, because he said that's the question that particularly white Christians ask him when he makes a presentation. Yeah, but what do I do about racism? Interestingly, he makes a point that white Christianity tends to emphasize individual responsibility and the power of personal relationships, personal relationship with God through Christ, personal relationship with others as forces for change. And he says white Christians and white Christianity tends to diminish the impact of social systems and social structures and institutions. And so he mentions that earlier in the book, and then he gets to this chapter, and he speaks to personal responsibility, which I appreciate, because I actually think individual responsibility is significant and is critical. He frames essentially his approach. He forms an acronym. Is that the right word? Acronym. ARC, the Arc of Racial Justice. So it's an acronym. ARC, Awareness, Relationship, Commitment. And so he says, if white Christians would pursue the arc of racial justice, cultivate awareness, learn the history of the church, in particular the white church, with respect to race and racism in America. So his book is actually helpful, very helpful in that regard. He talks about watch documentaries. So I've mentioned the PBS documentary on the Black church. And so watch that. Listen to podcasts, follow blogs. people of color who are writing on these things. So I'm going to listen more and follow more about Jemar Tisby. He's an historian, professor. So pay attention to current events. Okay, it's not just history, but current events. So just cultivate awareness of the situation. Don't just live in an isolated little bubble. It's something out there or long ago, but become aware. Okay. Second, he talks about developing relationships with people of color, Black individuals, Hispanic, Asian. The tendency, he cites a statistic about, for every 100 friends a white person has, there's one Black person in there. Whereas it's for a Black person, there will be six six white friends. So just, it's disproportionate. Black people have more white friends than white people have Black friends. Okay. And so that's just a reality. So he talks about building relationships. Go to places where people of color are. Now, he's probably writing to a younger audience maybe than is listening right here, but he talks about joining sports clubs, sports leagues, other places, the gym and other places where people of color will be. Get involved in activities so whether it's a singing group or some other social group where people of color are, as you get involved in that activity, as you rub shoulders, you develop friendships. And so friendships are often formed around shared activities, okay? And so as you build relationships, you will hear stories. As you get to know folks, you will understand what's going on in their lives. And so building relationships is essential. Again, the arc of racial justice is to get to know folks and hear and become attentive to their struggles. And then commitment, and he says this is the hardest for folks to engage in because, I think relationships are hard to do also. We get a set of relationships, and by middle age, we're kind of on that path. And so it takes a lot of effort to form new relationships. And he says very openly, it's hard for all people to form relationships with people who look different than them. It's not just a white thing. This is a human thing. I concur with that. Commitment, he says, is the hardest. And so he offers suggestions. Create something. Write a sermon, start a blog, do a podcast, okay? Do things that begin to raise awareness, speak to the issue. So I'm trying to do that, okay, faithfully through what I'm doing right now at this very moment. Donate to organizations and causes that promote racial justice. Become an advocate for racial justice. Join different groups that are engaged in this work, okay? And so the work of committing time, energy, resources, effort, volunteer, service hours in the effort of seeking racial justice, he said, is going to be hard to do. Just a lot of folks just, it just pushes them too far. It's just hard to engage in. He does talk about speaking with legislators, so you can call state and federal legislators to advocate for and speak on behalf of racial justice legislation. So again, I commend all of those activities, and so there's nothing specifically in this acronym ARC, awareness, relationship, and commitment, that I find problematic. So morally problematic in any way. Practically highly problematic only because people behave like people. And he makes some references to the fact that this is hard to do. It's hard for any people to form meaningful relationships with people who don't look like them. All of us tend to cluster with folks who look like ourselves. We got birds of a feather flock together, the old adage, right? And so I would just concur with him in that regard. So what's problematic about the arc of racial justice is we just do the things we do. We're people. We're like everybody else. I'm like everybody else. I've got a set of routines. I get up in the morning. I go through the same little patterns, say my psalms, eat my yogurt. I come down. I record this podcast, the Basement Academy. I get about my day. I go to the office. Excuse me. I have family responsibilities. I have work responsibilities that often carry me out at night and obviously every weekend. So I have very limited discretionary time. And frankly, I think my job is no different. My world is no different than anybody else's. And so it's the problem of inertia. A body at rest remains at rest until a force sufficient acts against it to move it. And so it's law of physics, okay? A body in motion will remain on that path until a force acts against it, okay? And so that which is true in the physical world is true in the spiritual, relational world as well. And so there's certain realities to this world. So changing one's life is very difficult. Anybody who's a pastor, he mentions at one point, I was doing a little extra reading this morning, reading some things he'd written. And he says, I feel like I stand up and keep saying the same things over and over again, hoping that people will change. And I laughed to myself and I said, welcome to my world, pal. This is the life of a pastor. Every Sunday morning, I stand up and say something like, follow Jesus, love your neighbor, give yourself, sacrifice, be committed, and guess what I do the next week? The same thing, okay? And so I think he discounts that. And I think as a Christian, he ought to do greater theological analysis. I mentioned that yesterday. He doesn't account for the reality of sin. And so I've got this listed as the last piece here. It's more important, probably better to say now. The hard reality is we're all sinners, and all sinners tend to form tribes. It's what we do. We're made for relationship. God made us for a relationship and community. Well, we form twisted relationships a lot of time, or distorted relationships. So we form these moral tribes, ideological tribes, racial tribes, okay? So we form ourselves into groups convinced of our own righteousness. We look at others askance. We look at others as enemies or as opponents in some way. Every human being does this from the dawn of time. Cain looked at his brother Abel as an opponent, and so had to eliminate him. And so we just discount. We're not aware. We don't cultivate our deep enough awareness of how sin impacts us. And then you've got the reality. You can't read this, but it says majority versus minority. I don't care where you are. It's on the playground, in elementary school. It's in the lunchroom. We form cliques. We're the in group. You're the out group. And so anytime you have a majority, the tendency is that the minority is going to feel set upon, because the majority majority rules. We make a decision. All in favor say aye. And this would be true of a faculty meeting. Most faculty lean left politically, and so conservative-leaning faculty get outvoted all the time. I've been at a presbytery who for 20 years, I've been on the losing side of nearly every vote of what I think of consequence. All in favor, aye, and our left-leaning progressive folks say yes, and those opposed say no, and me and a few others, Greenwich and a few others, say no, and majority. So it's a majority-minority reality, and so it's a majority white country, and so blacks and Hispanics and Asians and others are the minority. Of course, it's not white privilege, it's majority privilege. And if we were to go to a majority black nation, but you had different tribes, the tribe that is the majority is going to be in charge, and people will accuse them of bad things. And so it's a majority minority split. The reality is sinners tend to prefer ourselves. We tend to prefer our own. We seek our own interests over the interest of others. This is a sinful human reality. It's playing itself out in America along racial lines because it's a majority white country and we all prefer our own. We're all sinners, every one of us. Okay, so I think that's the hard reality that I wish Tisby would lean into better. As a person of faith, he has the opportunity to speak more clearly to that, and he doesn't. Okay, some biblical considerations then that we should make, I believe, as we think about how to love our neighbor well. So the golden rule, do to others as you would have them do to you. You've been in the minority in some place. And so when you're in a context where you're the majority, remember what it's like to be the minority and make sure that minority voice gets heard, make sure that minority interest is considered. Okay, so golden rule, let's live by Jesus' teaching. The Good Samaritan. He comes along, one in need, and so the Good Samaritan's given in answer to a person, well, what are the commandments? Love God, love your neighbor. And the lawyer desiring to justify himself, and who is my neighbor? He's trying to create the smallest circle possible around the neighbor. Who do I have to love? And so Jesus tells the Good Samaritan in response to the lawyer's question about the neighbor. Looking for a loophole, one translation says, the lawyer asked this question, who is my neighbor? And we're always looking for a loophole. And so the Good Samaritan tells the story, your neighbor is anyone whose need you see, whose need you can meet. That person is your neighbor. Go love them. Anyone whose need you see, whose need you can meet, go love that person, even if it's at cost. And of course, the Good Samaritan was inconvenienced, paid out of his pocket. Okay, and so that's the story. Okay, so let's be good Samaritans. Follow the golden rule. Let's be good Samaritans. When we become aware of a need we can meet around any need, but certainly in racial lines, let's do what we can. So Afghan refugees, we are trying. It's a need we can meet, and we are doing something about it. Okay. Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. It's just a restatement of the golden rule. So it's the Apostle Paul. Do not look only to your own interests. Everybody does that. Love your neighbor as yourself. We assume you love yourself. Love your neighbor in the same manner. Look not only to your own interests, but look to the interests of others. This is what followers of Christ do. Be attentive to the stranger in your midst. In the Old Testament, God would talk about caring for the foreigner in your midst. And so we see that lived out, certainly in the context of the story of Ruth, Boaz, caring for the stranger, the foreigner in the midst. But it's that you were strangers in Israel. You were foreigners in Egypt. So you, Israel, were foreigners in Egypt. You understood what it's like. Israel, you were the minority. You were the slaves. You were set upon. You were the oppressed. So when you get liberated, pay attention to that person, that foreigner, that stranger in your midst. You know how painful it was to be the minority, to be oppressed. So pay attention to others. Christians, we have a history of being oppressed, being persecuted. In our country, Christianity is the majority religion, and we've forgotten to care for the stranger in our midst. And I think that's very important. The quartet of the vulnerable, we've talked about that. The widows, the orphans, the poor, and the foreigner in the midst, okay? And so that's the Old Testament lifts that up. Care for the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the foreigner in your midst. And so that's what often called the quartet of the vulnerable. And then Jesus picks up on that theme with, as you've done this to the least of these brothers of mine, you've done it to me, in Matthew chapter 25. And so these are some biblical considerations that would lead us towards caring for those who have been set upon. Now, what I haven't said is let's go lobby our legislators and let's advocate for certain legislation. That's harder for me because we do that not monolithically, right? I can't say the Christian view of race and racism is this, and therefore the best legislative, economic, fair housing policy is Y. There's a lot of times it is, I think, pretty clear, but Christians of good conscience disagree on many, many things when it comes to legislative assemblies and legislative policy. And so I don't believe I ought to be advocating for specifics in that regard. Now, there are Christians who disagree with me. Those are usually folks who are a little more strident, both on the right and the left, than I am. I want to be strident for Christ, not for a particular policy or legislation. Now, are there policies that I'm committed to? Yes. But how I live out my faith, and lest I lose a hearing for the gospel of Jesus Christ, I'm reluctant. Tisby would disagree with me. Many others would disagree with me, both on the right and the left. Black and white would disagree with how I frame it. And maybe we can speak to those things in the future. But we've gone back, I have spoken to this in the past. We have to be careful when we read something to Israel. We have to understand the context of the covenant community. So Tisby talks about reparations, and he quotes from Daniel, he quotes from Numbers to talk about collective guilt for past responsibilities, okay? Or collective responsibility for past guilt. I guess those go the same way. Well, that's in the context of Israel as a covenant community. What Tisby doesn't also mention is that the Old Testament has God commanding them to go take that land. And so Israel isn't commanded to give back the land to the Philistines, the Canaanites. They're commanded to take the land and remove them, drive them out, or kill them. And that's really hard. I mean, that's a hard thing there. And so you have to be careful about cherry picking certain approaches. And so he advocates for reparations for black people in America based on Numbers chapter 5 and prayer in Daniel and the experience of Zacchaeus. He mentions Zacchaeus paying back anyone that he's wronged. I don't make as clear a theological argument as that for reparations. There may be good arguments for reparations in America, but I don't believe those cherry-picked verses are the best way to do that. And so that's for another day. Well, let's close now. Let me advocate to you to be engaged in following Jesus in all ways and give attention to the clear teaching that our Lord has given us to love our neighbors and to love those who are downcast. Let's pray. Father, hear our prayer as we make it now in the name of Jesus. We honestly acknowledge the struggle that this is, and pray for myself as an advocate and preacher and teacher, and pray for all who would listen and others, Lord, that we would wrestle deeply with the current moment, what we can do to bring about your just and peaceful kingdom. We ask this in the name of Christ our Lord, who taught us to pray together, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, and thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Oh, may the God who sent his Son Jesus to love you in your distress, may that God watch over you, keep you, and bless you today and forevermore. Amen.